Hi everyone, welcome to week 13 of CHD 141, The History of Childhood. Today we're going to be talking about a relatively short period of our nation's history, but it had a tremendous impact on childhood. The difference between the way that childhood was viewed for the poor and working classes prior to the Great Depression was very different from the childhood that they experienced after the Great Depression. So we're going to take a little bit of time to talk about this today. This will probably be one of our shorter lectures in regards to watching the videotape today, but I did want to make sure that you guys have just a general overview of the Great Depression. We're going to talk briefly about what it was like to be a child growing up during the Great Depression. We'll look at lots of photographs today of the Great Depression to help illustrate some of those key points. We're going to talk about what happened during the Great Depression after FDR took office, his New Deal, and the parts of the New Deal that were specific to the needs of children and families. And then we'll also do a video analysis activity today. We're going to look at a couple of Shirley Temple video clips, as well as one more clip from the Gold Diggers, and you guys will select one of those video clips to do your analysis for the attendance portion of this week's class. You do not need to have anything in front of you for this week, so just the videos are plenty. So today, like I mentioned before, we're going to start off by talking just really briefly about the history of the Great Depression. And a lot of people know about the stock market crash of 1929, and that's largely to blame for the Great Depression, but there were other factors that were involved during this time frame as well. It was kind of like everything kind of came together in a perfect storm, and people were really impacted by all of these events. So we have the stock market crash of 29. We also have some interesting political decisions being made, particularly with Europe and the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act that's going to have an impact on the economy. We have the Dust Bowl, which was something that no one could predict. Well, to some extent, I guess they could have predicted it, but it was definitely partially man-made and partially made by the weather itself. We have bank failures because banks didn't have the infrastructure back in those days to keep up with all of the changing economic downfalls that were occurring in the latter part of the 1920s and 1930s. And then as a result of all of these other things that were happening, we have people reducing their spending across the board simply because they didn't want to go out and spend money that they didn't have in the 1930s, which was very different from the 1920s when people were spending quite a bit of money that they didn't have. So this is basically just a quick little timeline of the economic crash. So Herbert Hoover was elected in 1929. I mention that here because he and he alone tends to get a lot of the blame for the downfall of the economy, but he really wasn't in office for a very long period of time. It was more about the economic precedent that had already been set in place by his predecessor, which he continued when he took office as well. The actual Black Friday, I'm going shopping now. The actual Black Tuesday event occurred on October 29th, 1929, but it's interesting to note that the stock market actually hit a high on September 3rd of 1929. And part of the reason for that high was that people who were in the know, knowledgeable investors, people that had some pout and some political power when it came to the finances of the United States, were working really hard to make sure that it didn't crash. They knew that this was coming, and so bankers and others were kind of forcing money into the stock market to try to keep it from happening. So they were trying to protect us, but in essence, there was really nothing that could be done at this point that they had the power to change anyways. So the actual crash itself took place on Tuesday, October 29th. FDR was elected in 1932. The Dust Bowl really occurred for a longer period of time, but primarily it was at its worst from about the early to mid 1930s. The bank failures, so the banks actually going out of business, happened starting in 1930 and continued through 1932. And then just as a result of all of these things that were going on, the rest of the world was suffering economically as well. So it wasn't just us. Europe in particular was really going through their own depression at the same time, economically speaking. So just a quick little bit of background information on the stock market crash of 1929. So back in the 1920s, remember we talked about the fact that people were spending a ton of money and people were really confident about the economy in the 1920s. And as a result of all this kind of spending and this sense of optimism that the economy was going to continue to improve, a lot of people bought stocks on on credit. And when they bought these stocks on credit, they didn't necessarily know what they were doing. Everybody kind of wanted to get a little piece of the pie, if you will, during this era. So janitors, school teachers, doctors, nurses, everyone was trying to get in on the stock market. They wanted to get their own money and their own wealth kind of built up through the stock market. So what they did, and what was common policy back in those days, is they would buy the stocks on credit. So let's say that I wanted to go out and buy $500 worth of stocks. I would buy my $500 worth of stocks, and they cost $2 a piece, but I couldn't really afford that. So I'd pay $250 and I'd borrow the other $250, and my assumption would be the hope that, it's my $500 worth of stock is going to be worth $10,000 in a couple of years from now, and I'd be rich beyond my wildest dreams. So around the latter part of 1929, the stock market prices started to dip. And every time they dipped, the people that had bought their stocks on credit had to make a choice. They could either sell their shares at a loss, or they could borrow more money to try to keep their shares. So my stockbroker might call me. He might say, hey, Kelly, those stocks that you bought at $2 a piece, they're now worth 75 cents a piece. So we need you to make up the difference, or we're going to be selling those off for you. And so people were going through little mini panic modes, and they were scrambling, trying to keep the things that they had purchased. And as a result of that, they were borrowing more and more. I gave you kind of a small scale example of that, but this was occurring at a large scale as well. So that by the time we get to Black Tuesday, which is in the latter part of October, over 16 million shares were traded on that day when people kind of went into panic mode. And that's when we saw the stock market crash. And so people who had bought stocks back in 1929 found that those same stocks by 1932 were only worth about 20% of what they had been worth 3 years before. People who could afford to sit on those stocks and just wait it out, and who were lucky enough that those businesses hadn't gone out of business, could continue to wait it out, and eventually they would start to go up again in 10 or 15 years. But the majority of the population couldn't wait it out because they had purchased everything on credit. So most people fell into an economic decline. Now, as those businesses started to fall in economic decline and go out of business, people also found themselves unemployed. So in 1929, the U.S. unemployment rate was only about 3.1%. By the time we get to 1933, the U.S. unemployment rate is nearly 30%. So nearly 1 in 3 Americans didn't have a job, and they were actively looking for work. Here's a couple of photographs that help illustrate this. So these two gentlemen right here are basically wearing, signboards on themselves. And they're standing in front of these larger corporations and they're saying, hey, hire us, we need jobs. This guy over here, you can see his entire message. So he's a family man, he's 37 years old, he's a war veteran, he's got a mortgage, he's college trained, but he still can't find a job. And sites like this were pretty common to see in the early part of the 1930s. Here's another example. So they even brought their kids to the picket lines with them. And you can see this little guy over here holding a sign that says, hey, why can't you give my dad a job? And this little girl holding a sign that says, Rarick's kids don't starve, why should we? And so I wanted to point this part of the sign out because it was really important to also know that there were definite class distinctions in regards to how the Great Depression impacted people. The poorer you were, the more likely the Great Depression was to have a huge impact on you leading up to the Great Depression. So Rarick's kids, Rarick was an engineer, he was a business owner, and he was relatively unscathed as a result of the Great Depression. Probably he had a sense that it was coming, so he had prepared for it. And having that opportunity to know a little bit more about how the economy worked definitely helped out the folks that were on the higher end of the income spectrum. So another policy that I had just mentioned was the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. And basically, it's what it sounds like. You guys all know from recent history what tariffs are. So, tariffs are taxes on items that are brought in from other countries. And as kind of a reaction to the economic downcline, Hoover decided he was going to make money for the country by raising the average tariff by about 20% on goods that were brought into the country by other places. So the goal of this is twofold. It's to make more money off of those items that are being imported, but it's also to encourage people to buy more American goods because the price of those imported goods goes up as a result of these higher tariffs. But this backfired because everybody was starting to have economic issues. It wasn't just us. So overseas, their banks were beginning to fail as well. They were going through their own Great Depression, and the other countries retaliated. So within 2 years, 20 of the major countries had created similar acts of retaliation to circumnavigate Hoover's Tariff Act. So I'm just going to show you guys a real quick little video clip here. This is from Ferris Bueller's Day Off. It's one of my favorite movie scenes of all time, and it ties in really nicely with this whole idea.
It's tough to quit smoking cold turkey, so Chantix can help you quit slow turkey, along with...
In 1930, the Republican-controlled House of Representatives, in an effort to alleviate the effects of the... Anyone? The Great Depression, passed the... Anyone? The tariff bill, the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, which... Anyone raised or lowered? Raised tariffs in an effort to collect more revenue for the federal government. Did it work? Anyone know the effects? It did not work, and the United States sank deeper into the Great Depression. Today, we have a similar debate over this. Anyone know what this is, class? Anyone seen this before? The Laffer curve. Anyone know what this says? It says that at this point on the revenue curve, you will get exactly the same amount of revenue as at this point. This is very controversial. Does anyone know what Vice President Bush called this?
So I was showing this video at this point because we've been talking about economics for a few minutes now, and this isn't super interesting, but it's kind of good to have a little bit of background on. From here, we're going to move into the Dust Bowl. And so I had mentioned briefly as I was doing the intro that the Dust Bowl was a weather-related event, but it was also a land usage related event. So during World War I, we needed lots and lots of food to feed our own citizens and also our soldiers who were off at war. Particularly, we needed wheat because wheat could be made into bread, and bread could be stored and crossed across the ocean to feed our troops. So during World War I, wheat was $2 a bushel. And if you were a farmer and you could sell wheat for $2 a bushel, you did. You did everything you could to make sure that your land produced as much wheat as possible in order to sell off this product. And of course, the price is going to drop after the war, and that's pretty typical. So it dropped down to $1 after the war. But in essence, what happened was that farmers needed to make more crop in order to continue to make more money after the war was over, and certainly after the stock market crash occurred when wheat dropped to 17 cents a bushel. So in order to make more money, they raised more crops. That meant that they needed to plow more land. And in essence, they kind of turned the middle part of the United States into a piece of land that was covered in dirt, right? There was just dirt everywhere. All the natural grasses and stuff had been removed in order to make room for all of the wheat that was being grown. On top of that, a drought hit in the mid part of the 1930s, and we didn't have the agricultural system that we have in place. We didn't have canals and things like that yet back in the mid 1930s. So when this drought hit, they literally had no way to basically water all that dirt, and it turned into what was known as the Dust Bowl. And the Dust Bowl states really were these kind of red states right here. This is where the most damage occurred, but other areas were also damaged by those dust storms. Those dust storms were huge. They literally covered the sky and prevented the sun from shining through for several months at a time. They said that in some areas, when the wind blew in the middle of the Dust Bowl, there was a dust cover all the way over here on the east coast of the United States. So basically, during the Dust Bowl, a lot of people who had recently depended upon farming in order to survive and to feed their families could no longer do so. So a lot of those folks moved either to the West Coast over here to California or to the East Coast, and were not able to farm any longer. Excuse me. Another issue during this time frame was the bank failures. So back in these days, there was no FDIC. If you go to banks today, you'll see that little FDIC insured symbol on the side of the bank, and you know that your money is safe. Back in the 1920s, 1930s, there was no federal insurance for covering your money if something happened. So when the banks started to fail, people lost their entire savings. This picture right here that you see on the bottom are people who are going to the bank to try to get their money out of the bank, and those doors are locked. There's no way into the bank. Their money's in there, but they can't get to it. So people lost everything, particularly people who put a lot of their money into the banks. My husband's mom is from an earlier generation. She was actually born right around the same time, and she stores money everywhere in her home. When you go into her home to help clean or help her fix something, you'll find cans of money in the walls, under the bed, in the mattress. And I think that's pretty typical of people from this particular generation who grew up during this time, because they're terrified of the banks. She still has money in the bank as well, but this is like her extra little security, so that if anything happens to the banks, she knows that she'll be covered. Today, we tend to have everything kind of attached to our debit cards, but in those days, they didn't do that because they were terrified that something like this might occur again. And then I mentioned also, too, that there was a reduction in spending across the board. So if you look at this little map right here, this is the Consumer Price Index, and you can see it kind of reaching its peak here right around 1926. And then, wow, look what happens when we get to 1933. So definitely we have, people not spending money anymore. As a result of people not spending money, there's not as much economic growth occurring. There's economic decline occurring during this time frame. So right now I'm going to show you a series of photos. Many of these photos were taken by a photographer named Dorothea Lange. She was kind of the Great Depression equivalent of Lewis Hines, where she went in and tried to document what was happening with families during the Great Depression. So this photo that you're looking at right now is probably one of the most famous photos in American history. And this photo really kind of shows and illustrates the despair that the mother's feeling during this time period, and also to the fact that her children are sort of clinging to her and looking to her for protection and to kind of save them from this whole economic uncertainty that they've been born into. These guys are sharecroppers, and I think this one illustrates really well the lack of water and the fact that no water could be wasted, because every last drop of water was needed for your family to drink, and hopefully to raise a little bit of food so that you had some food that you could grow to support your family. So taking a bath had definitely become a luxury by this point in our nation's history. And here's another photo of the sharecroppers, and this kind of shows their home, kind of the shanty that they were living in during this time frame. So many families took what they had left and they moved, and I had mentioned this a little bit a few minutes ago. But they got down to the point where they simply had nothing left. And so they gathered up their loved ones, they gathered up the few belongings that they hadn't sold yet, and a lot of them came west. And you'll see a large influx of people coming to California in particular during this time frame. So I had mentioned that Herbert Hoover was not particularly popular with the population, partially because of his Tariff Act, but honestly, a lot of this was simply what he had inherited when he came into office. And so people didn't necessarily take that into account. They just weren't super happy with their new president. And so a lot of times the little shacks that sprung up as a result of the Great Depression were called Hoovervilles. And this is an example of a Hooverville back here in the background. You can see a better example here. So when people were forced from their homes, they would basically go to, a bare plot of land that they could find, and they'd use scrap wood or whatever other materials they could find to build shelter for themselves and their families. And you can see what some of these kind of ramshackle sort of shelters look like here in this photo with the children sitting in front of it. And this was another example of what people called a Hooverville. So if you were a little kid growing up during this time, you were probably poor. There was a good chance that you were poor, particularly if your family had been working class or middle class prior to the Great Depression. The number of unemployed adults increased by 400%, so there's a good chance that your mom or dad didn't have a job. Racism got worse again. Remember I mentioned in the 1930s that even though it was this sort of wonderful time, it wasn't wonderful for everyone because racism increased. It actually became worse again as people began to sort of separate themselves from others, in a sense, to say like, hey, this job is only for me, or this job is only for my husband, kind of an idea. So racism got worse. Children were often homeless. Up to 200,000 children were homeless during the Great Depression. And for a lot of older kids, teenagers, a lot of them simply just ran away from home. And it wasn't because they didn't love their parents or their families. It was really because they did. And they just said, hey, I'm probably better off on my own, and my family's probably better off not having to feed me. So a lot of kids jumped on trains, ran away basically, and tried to make a better life for themselves where they could work and support themselves. Classism became even more rampant. So remember all those Save the Child movements that we had before? A lot of those crumbled during the Great Depression. The people who had originally created those programs, the orphanages, the orphan train, and those types of places simply couldn't afford to do that anymore. Those were paid for by individuals, not by the government in the early cases. So when that happened, a lot of kids were forced back out into the streets. Children lost their jobs. A lot of kids who worked in factories before this to help support their families lost their jobs, so they were no longer able to kind of help out in that way anymore. So basically, if you were poor, you became incredibly poor, probably oftentimes to the point of hunger. If you were middle class, you probably were forced to cut back and to live a very, very lean life. And if you were wealthy, prior to the Great Depression, you probably were still wealthy during the Great Depression, because a lot of those folks knew what was coming and they had prepared for it in different ways. If you look at education in the 1930s, you'll see an actual decline in the number of schools and the number of children going to schools. It's estimated that about 20,000 schools closed during this time frame. Kids couldn't go to school oftentimes because they didn't have proper clothing to wear to school, or they couldn't bring a lunch. They were so poor that they didn't have enough food to eat while they were at school. So a lot of folks just kind of stayed in bed or stayed close to home as much as possible to conserve the very scarce resources that they did have. Also in the 1930s, parents were often asked to buy the books that the children used or the materials that the children used. And a lot of people couldn't afford to buy those materials anymore, so they didn't send their kids to school because they didn't have the basic necessities that they needed. So there were some children's books that came out in the 1930s, and these are some examples of those 1930 kind of books. You'll see a nice combination here of picture books for the younger kids and chapter books for the slightly older kids. And again, this would be a point where we kind of pause and talk about some of the themes that we notice. But basically, if you look through these books, there is kind of a common theme here for a lot of them. One of the themes that you notice when you look at these is that there's kind of like believe in yourself or believe in the impossible kind of a theme to a lot of these books. There's also a theme of rescue to a lot of these books where the main character is rescuing someone else or being rescued by someone else. So those were really common themes during this time frame as well. I also wanted to point out this book because you may not have heard of this one, but it really is illustrative of the kind of mindset of the 1930s. Naughty Amelia Jane was a little homemade toy. And there were other toys in the child's home that were store-bought, but she was naughty because she was a homemade toy versus the store-bought toys, which were the good toys. So even with kids and with literature, you will see that there's that idea like, okay, let's get a book out here that encourages children to encourage their parents to buy them some toys so that they'll go out and start spending money again. Amelia Jane isn't entirely naughty because she does rescue the other toys at the end of the book, but that beginning part of the book where it talks about the fact that she's homemade, so she's somehow defective, is there. Let's see. Oh, that's right. So what I was going to do is show you the questions first this time so that you knew what to expect. And then I'm going to show you the video clips second. So when you guys watch the video clips today for today's primary document analysis activity, you're going to watch 3 clips. For the questions, you're going to tell me which one you liked the most, what theme you noticed or themes you noticed from the films. Question number 3 is you're going to either pick the Shirley Temple video and talk about how she was influential, or you're going to pick the Gold Diggers video and talk about how they were influential. And then what impact do you think, or how did they make the people feel during the 1930s, during the Great Depression? And then select one word to describe these films. So the first one that we're going to watch is a little clip from Baby Takes a Bow. This came out in 1934. Before I go into the video, I just want to give a little bit of a plug to the Shirley Temple films because she was very popular with both children and adults during this time. And part of the reason for her popularity was because she brought a feeling of hope to this nation. She brought a feeling that things were going to get better. And so in the 1930s, even in 1934 and 1935, people could afford to go to the movies in a lot of cases. Movies were only about 5 or 10 cents. So a lot of people went to the movies, they paid their 5 or 10 cents, and they used it as a form of escapism. And that was really common during this time frame. So just kind of keep those ideas in mind as you're watching all 3 clips. And again, you're going to pick one of them to do for your analysis. So here's Baby Takes a Bow.
Her right now, baby, take a bow.
Where'd you find that lovely cameo?
I'm presenting her right now, baby, take a bow. Hear them whispering,
Isn't she the sweetest thing?
you're a standout.
She's cute, she's sweet, she's swell, she's grand. Who's the future Mrs. Hemingway?
Just a minute, ladies. I'm presenting her right now. Baby, take a bow.
Everybody's asking me, who's that bunch of personality? I'm presenting you right now. Daddy, take a bow. Everybody wants to know, who's that great big handsome Romeo? I'm presenting
see how people could just kind of, escape for a little while when they were watching her films. Here's the next one.
My soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. God bless Mrs. Denham. God bless Mrs. Denham. And God bless the trustees, and please make us good children.
So I have a second little clip that goes with Curly Top. And hopefully you'll recognize
Need a professional
this
website?
one.
I created one for our startup using Wix. Let me show you how I did it.
You might recognize this or the song.
Animal crackers in my soup, monkeys and rabbits loop the loop. Gosh, oh gee, but I have fun swallowing animals one by one. In every bowl of soup I see lions and tigers watching me. I make 'em jump right through a hoop, those animal crackers in my soup. When I get hold of the big bad wolf, I just push him under the ground. Then I bite him in a million bits, and I gobble him right down. When they're inside me where it's dark, I walk around like Noah's Ark. I stuff my tummy like a goop with animal crackers in my soup. Animal crackers in my soup do funny things to me. They make me think my neighborhood is a big menagerie. For instance, there's our janitor. His name is Mr. Klein. And when he hollers at us kids, he reminds me of a lion. The grocer is so big and fat, he has a big mustache. He looks just like a walrus just before he takes a splash. Animal crackers in my soup, kids and rabbits loop the loop. Gosh, oh gee, but I have fun swallowing animals one by one. In every bowl of soup I see lions and tigers watching me. I make 'em jump right through a hoop, those animal crackers in my soup. When I get hold of the big bad wolf, I just push him under the ground. Then I bite him in a million bits, and I gobble him right down. When they're inside me where it's dark, I walk around like Noah's Ark. I stuff my tummy like a goop with animal crackers in my soup. When they're inside me where it's dark, I walk around like Noah's Ark. I stuff my tummy like a goop with animal crackers in my soup. goodness.
Singing in the dining room. Madam, is this the kind of manners you teach them?
Why, of course not, Mr. Wyckoff. They've been told they must always be quiet at mealtime.
Oh, they've been told, have they? Well, just telling them doesn't seem to be good enough. Perhaps a bit of real discipline wouldn't do them any harm. Have you been told not to sing in the dining room?
Yes, sir.
Then why do you do it? You're a bad and wicked child. You know that, don't you?
She isn't a bad or wicked child. She's just a baby. She was making the children laugh. Besides, it wasn't her fault. I told her to sing for the children.
And who are you, young woman? Are you an orphan, too?
Yes, sir.
Then what right have you to be here, living on charity at your age?
I'll tell you what I'm doing here. I scrub the floors and make the beds and wash and iron and cook from 6 in the morning until 9 at night.
Quiet!
I won't be quiet. You're a mean and hateful man to frighten little children. Mary, report to my office after the meeting. Yes, ma'am. The rest of you will go to the main yard and wait there till it's time for inspection by our dear trustees.
We are being censored.
So if you haven't heard Animal Crackers in My Soup before, sing Curly Top, and you have a little extra time this summer, it's well worth it to kind of go through and watch a few of her movies, because you can definitely see how people in the 1930s were enthralled by this young actress. I also wanted to mention a quick shout out to Shirley Temple's mom. Shirley Temple has credited her mom, her family, but her mom in particular, with really helping to keep her grounded. She never had any of the problems that a lot of child stars had. She said her mom was just really down to earth, and she was just her best friend when she was growing up. So those are a couple of clips from Shirley Temple. This is a clip from Gold Diggers. I already brought it up because there's quite a few lengthy commercials that are at the beginning of this one. So I'll just show it from here.
I can remember when that alarm clock used to ring. Those good old days when you had to get up.
Come on, let's get up and look for work. I hate starving in bed.
Name me a better place to starve.
Your stomach.
Well, let's get up and get dressed. I thought we might try the flea circus. Maybe they got something for us there.
What can we get at a flea circus?
Fleas?
You can get those here. All right, come on, let's get up. 1, 2, 3.
How about some nourishment?
Yeah, what's on the menu, Trixie?
Well, we'll see what the neighbors have to offer. You guys cut the bread and set the table. Have we any bread?
Yeah, have we any table?
What neighbors? Oh, what neighbors. I can remember not so long ago a penthouse on Park Avenue with a real tree and flowers and a fountain and a French maid and a warm bath with salt from Yardley's and a little dress that Chaparelli ran up and a snappy roadster and a ride through the park. Now stealing milk. That's all right. The dairy company stole it from a cow. Just about a year ago this time, I was on my way to Havana. The birds were singing and the sky was blue. And I said to the big mug in the next pew, I need a couple of $100, big boy. And he said, in my pants pocket. You know, I reached over and I took $500 out of his back pants pocket just like that. And all I got left were his pajamas, and I'm a milk snatcher. Guess we gotta give it back. Maybe it's a
Okay, so we'll go ahead and stop there on that one for today, but you can see how those actresses are just kind of barely getting by at this point as they move into the Great Depression. And So going back to the questions for just a moment, this is a great place to pause the video and answer those questions. Put that in the attendance and participation tab for your class for this week. So going into a little bit of information in regards to entertainment for kids, we did have televisions in many homes in 1938 or by 1938. There weren't a lot of things to watch on those televisions back in 1938. There were really only a few channels that were broadcast, and they certainly weren't broadcast for children. It was primarily news channels and that type of thing. So TV wasn't a big form of entertainment. Radio, however, was. There were many radio programs that were specific for children that told little stories for kids. I have a clip here. It's an audio clip of a radio program from the 1930s called Buck Rogers. And you guys can listen to that if you have time. We're going to go ahead and skip through it today, but they did do a lot of listening to the radio. Board games were popular in the 1930s. If you had some, Monopoly and Scrabble were available, and you could spend hours and hours playing those games and give you some entertainment for relatively low cost. Newspapers had comics in them in the 1930s, so comics that kids could enjoy. Dad could read the front page of the paper, mom could read the home and health section, and the child could read the comics at the back, and that provided entertainment for the entire family. Shirley Temple dolls were really popular during this time frame, and they were mass produced so that they were somewhat affordable for some kids. Bikes, a lot of kids rode bikes during this time. They had building sets like Lincoln Logs and that kind of thing. And Mickey Mouse and Snow White were starting to become very popular during this time frame. So you might be able to afford a Mickey Mouse doll. He was not the handsomest little mouse back in the 1930s, but he was getting there. These are a couple of movie clips from the 1930s. I'm going to show you just a quick little snippet from the first one, mainly because I want you to see how much the technology has changed from the Steamboat Willie video that we watched last week. So here's just a quick little snippet from the Three Little Pigs. Oops, I closed it. Sorry about that. We could definitely watch that whole clip all day long, but I wanted you to see how much it's improved in regards to the technology, the sound, and these picture are much closer to one another than they were in the previous video from just a few years before. You also see the color in this particular video. Disney actually released his first full-length feature, which was Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. That came out in 1937. So again, you can see, within that movie itself, the huge improvement in technology that Hollywood is going through. So Hollywood is still producing during the 1930s. And again, like I mentioned before, this provided a form of escape for children and their families. If they could afford the 5 or 10 cents for a movie ticket, they could kind of forget their troubles for a while and enjoy these movies. A couple other movies that came out during this time that were popular with kids, a Robin Hood movie with Errol Flynn, the original, came out in 1938, and The Wizard of Oz, which I know a lot of you have probably seen. It might have been a few years, but that came out in 1939. This is the Ugly Duckling movie right here. That came out in 1939 as well. So let's talk a little bit about FDR and the New Deal, because, even when things were at their worst, one of the interesting components of the Great Depression is that people still had hope. And FDR brought hope to the nation. And one of the ways that he brought hope to the nation was through his political policies, and specifically the New Deal and the Second New Deal. And so the very first thing that FDR did after he was elected to office was he created a 4-day bank holiday to basically stop the money flow. Remember, people were pulling their money out of the banks faster than the bank could keep up. And banks were closing because they couldn't keep up with that money flow. So the first thing he did was say, okay, let's stop. Everybody just kind of put the brakes on for a couple days. Let's get together and let's figure out how to make this stop. So he closed the banks for 4 days. At the same time, he got together with the heads of his financial advisors and the heads of the banks, and he said, let's pass something to make this stop. And so he passed the Emergency Banking Act on March 9th, 1933. That was his first big piece of legislation as president of the United States. He also eliminated prohibition because, quite frankly, if you can sell alcohol, you can tax alcohol. And he realized that people, the government in particular, would make a lot of money by taxing alcohol and selling alcohol here in the United States. A couple other components of the first New Deal were the passage of the Tennessee Valley Authority Act and the passage of the Agricultural Adjustment Act. And what these two components did was they helped to build the infrastructure for water delivery in the United States. So building things like dams and canals and that type of thing would allow farmers in those areas to have water available to them even during times of drought. This also put people to work because we needed people to build those dams and to dig those canals. So this got a lot of people back to work, and it gave the farmers a sense of hope that they were going to be able to continue their farms and produce food for the nation. As the second part of the New Deal, he created what was called the Works Progress Administration. And so again, this is going to get lots of people to work. During this time frame, this is when many of the schools and post offices and highways and parks were being built in the United States. So this gets people back to work, gives all these dads that previously had jobs again, and they're able to start producing something that really matters for the nation, like schools and highways and things like that. He also signed the Wagner Act in 1935, which was to oversee working conditions for employees. And that included child employees as well, those that were left still. In August of 1935, he signed the Social Security Act. Probably the most important part of this was pensions, and we still talk about those pensions today, even though those will probably be gone by the time you or I get to retirement age. But pensions were available for workers so that they could retire eventually. The biggest component for the purposes of our class is this component right here, this aid to families with dependent children. So for the first time, parents had a federally run and supervised kind of safety net for themselves and for their children. So if you were in a situation where you couldn't find work, you couldn't find a job, or maybe you had lost your spouse, you could apply to aid to families with dependent children so that you didn't have to lose your children. You could keep your children, and you would have enough money, not a ton of money, but you would have enough money for you to survive. This also included a component that allowed for payments if a person had paid into Social Security and then was deceased or disabled. So, for example, let's say that a child lost his or her father and he had paid into Social Security. The child would get a monthly allowance from Social Security that would help him or her to survive. Remember, prior to this, if your dad died, and usually dads were the primary breadwinner, if dad died, the family became destitute. So now they had kind of a safety net that prevented them from becoming destitute as well. So these are some of the components of the Social Security Act and the New Deal that were specific to children and young people. So the Child Health Recovery Conference was held in 1933. Again, this was one of FDR's first kind of acts that he did. And basically what he said, or what was a part of this conference, was that the federal government has a responsibility to take care of their children. Specifically, they have a responsibility to make sure that the children of of America are healthy and safe. And so this was the first time you had a group of individuals coming together at the government level and saying, what do we need to do? Let's outline a plan so that we can make sure that everyone has medical care, everyone has options to be safe at work and safe at home as well. The Civilian Conservation Corps was established in 1933. And the Civilian Conservation Corps was kind of like the AmeriCorps program is today, if you've heard of that. It was basically a program for young people, specifically 17 to 28-year-olds, and it gave them a job. They worked as volunteers, but they also received a salary at the same time. And so these guys were given jobs. They went out into the world, basically, or into the United States, and they helped build roads, they helped build trails, they helped build national parks, they made buildings, they did all kinds of really neat stuff, and they earned a salary for doing that. And at the same time, they also helped to kind of beautify America. So an example of this would be Zion National Park. If any of you have ever visited Zion National Park before, they were the ones who were responsible for putting those trails in. Or up in Oregon, there's a lodge called Timberline Lodge that's really, really beautiful that a lot of people travel to go hiking and things like that. And they built that lodge. So basically, they did something that mattered, and they got a paycheck at the same time. And for a lot of 17 to 28-year-olds in 1933, this was an incredible blessing because they were the ones who couldn't find jobs. We talked a little bit about the Social Security Act, but I want to focus a little bit more on this part right here, Title V of the Social Security Act. This was the part of the Social Security Act that focused on mothers and children. So this provided aids to families with dependent children. It also provided health care and things like that to families who couldn't afford it. So Title V was the most important part of the act from our purposes, from a child perspective. The National Youth Administration was similar to the Civilian Conservation Corps. Basically, it was a little bit more open in terms of the type of jobs that were available to young people. So girls or boys could be part of the National Youth Administration. They could do all kinds of jobs. They could become typists or secretaries. They could do general labor and that kind of thing. But it was intended for 16 to 25-year-olds to kind of give them that first step into the workforce, to give them some very early work experience. And then this one we've talked about before, the Fair Labor Standards Act, that was also part of FDR's New Deal. And as part of the Fair Labor Standards Act, children were prohibited from working in dangerous jobs under the age of 18. There was also very limited scope, very limited types of jobs children could do under the age of 14. So 16-year-olds could do almost anything. 14 and 15-year-olds could do jobs that were not during the school day and were not in mining or manufacturing. So it really limited the scope of what kids were able to do in the employment world. And look, after the Fair Labor Standards Act passed, our employment looks very much more like it does today in terms of what teenagers are able to do at the various ages. So to finish up today, I just want to remind you of the upcoming assignments that you have for next week. So next week, you guys are going to be reading Mints chapters 13 and 14, and then you're going to take the online quiz based on those two chapters. This is your last, quote-unquote, before class assignment of the semester. The only thing that you have left after you do this is going to be your final exam. And we'll talk a little bit more about the final exam last week, but I just wanted to remind you that the final exam is not cumulative. It's only based on the second half of the class. I also removed any questions that were based on chapters that you are not going to be reading for me this semester because of the modified schedule. So for the final exam, you guys are going to be reading chapters 7 through 15, and there's also a study guide if you want to start taking a look at that study guide under the Pages tab in order to prepare for the final exam. You may do that as well. So I hope you're doing good and everyone's having a great week, and I will look forward to talking to you again next week.